This is Thank You Mama, weekly lessons from mothers all around the world. Hello and welcome to Thank You Mama. My name is Anna Teider. My guest today is Sharon Blackie. Sharon is an award-winning writer, a mythologist specialized in Celtic Studies, and a psychologist specialized both in neuroscience and narrative. Her unique approach to working with myth, fairy tales, and folklore shows us how these traditions can help us deal with our personal, social, and environmental problems we face today. Dr. Blackie is the author of 4 books, including the bestseller If Women Rose Rooted, which is an exploration of the feminine in Celtic myths, highlighting women's connection with land, nature, and earth. Hegitude, which I just started reading and I'm so excited about, in which she unearths the stories of elder women in European myths and folklore to highlight the different ways women can flourish throughout all stages of life. In Enchanted Life, she reminds us to find the magic in every day. And in her first novel, which just got published as a paperback, The Long Delirious Burning Blue, she talks about a mother and a daughter and their difficult relationship as they are both trying to figure out where they stand in their own lives. It's also a story of burnout and storytelling. Sharon, welcome.
Anna, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be with you.
Did I miss anything?
You did actually.
Tell
My
me.
first book is a book of reimagined fairy tales called Foxfire Wolfskin and Other Stories of Shape-Shifting Women.
Oh, and that sounds fantastic. How did I miss that? Okay, we'll put this on the list. But I have also, Sharon, missed, you are so active as a teacher as well. How else do you reach out to women and support?
It's mostly through writing, I have to say. That's what I am at heart. And the heart of my writing, just like the heart of all of my other work, is about the imagination and transformation. And that's why I work with fairy tales and myths so much. Because when I was practicing as a psychologist, it was very clear to me that they captured the imagination so perfectly and helped us reimagine ourselves in ways that otherwise would have been very difficult to achieve. So the writing does that along with the teaching. I teach mostly academically these days, although it's very, it's easy academia, if you like. It's kind of open to everybody. And it's all about the same subject, about storytelling and about fairy tales and myths and the ways that they can help us see ourselves.
How did you get to where you are? Tell me a little bit about your path and about your life.
Kind of complicated. I mean, after school, I started an academic life and I didn't like that very much. Went into corporate life, which was a very bad antidote to academic life. Hated that even more. Burnout for sure. During that period in my early 30s, I left corporate life. And to cut a long story short, I went back to my roots as a psychologist, but this time working with narrative, with fairy tales, with myth, and practicing. And out of that, I'd always wanted to write, but I didn't really think that I had anything to say. And so when I had something to say, which very much sprung out of this psychology work, then I started publishing books.
Let's talk quickly about burnout. This is a very, very important topic to me, but I think to many people as well. It's interesting how many similarities we have. I also have a background in corporate life. I worked in a corporate field for around 11 years. And then I burned out. And reading your book, I recognize so many moments and experiences I dealt with. What really struck me was this reaction the doctors had where they want to say it's depression because I think for them it's the easiest solution and put people on antidepressants. I also had this moment where my intuition told me this is wrong. I'm burning out because I'm living a life that's not my life. I'm living a wrong life and I have to change things fundamentally in order to heal. and antidepressants would just numb me. So I went through this big, for me, my burnout was a spiritual awakening. I have a feeling, and from reading your books, this is the experience you had.
Very much so. I mean, there are at least two types of burnout. One simply caused by exhaustion, and that happens to so many women today, particularly when they're juggling families as well as jobs. But the other is really, it's a kind of crisis of authenticity, I think, as I look at it. And I knew that I was never to be that person who was in that corporate world. I'd known it really from the beginning, but I had a very complicated childhood and didn't feel safe for very much of it. And I wanted safety, so I took the easy way for safety. And it just got worse and worse as I began to realize that that was not my path. And breaking out of that, although it wasn't always easy and it wasn't always safe, was definitely the best thing I've ever done.
Do you have any recommendations for people who are facing this experience, who are dealing with this experience right now? Because I've been interviewed a lot about my burnout, and I had a lucky situation, because shortly before I burned out, my writing has found me. It literally fell on my lap, and I somehow miraculously started writing and realized, not only am I good at this, but this is what I should be doing. So this helped me.
Yes, I think what happens, generally speaking, is that if you have either the desperation or the courage, it can be both and a combination of both, to make the leap, it comes to you. It always comes to you. I've never known a person to whom that doesn't happen. I wanted to be a writer, but it hadn't found me. I hadn't found my story at that point. That came later. But I just knew that I had to break away from what I was doing. And I firmly believed that whatever I would do would find me. And there's this ancient concept in Greek mythology, particularly, and across the world, really, of a notion that psychologists today call calling, which is the idea that each of us has a particular gift, a particularly unique way of being in the world, and that as we walk through life, we're constantly trying to align with our calling. And often we step off the path, we don't align with our calling, but it's always coming to look for you again. And it's as if the world never gives up on you, that you're always pushed towards it. And I do believe that if you make these very courageous leaps, it will find you who you are. There will be space for who you are to develop and your authentic self to come to the fore, and you'll know what to do.
I absolutely agree with you. I think the universe awards courage in this sense. If you realize something is wrong, and whatever step you make towards changing it, as you say, it will find you. Certain things will start opening up. I would like to move towards if women rose rooted, which is how I discovered you. And I know that thousands and thousands of women out there found you through this book. You talk about women, and it's a beautiful reminder that we need to claim our power, which comes from us being connected to nature and to this world of energies, or whatever you want to call it, world of creation. But we do still function in a very, very deeply male system. And I think a big problem is that for too long we've been trying to reclaim our power by trying to imitate men. How do we go about this? How do we reclaim our power, which is what planet Earth desperately needs nowadays?
Yes, I think that there isn't just one way of doing this, and I think it's very difficult for a lot of women to do it, which is precisely why I wrote If Women Rose Rooted, because I think our old stories offer us various ways of being a woman who is rooted in her place. And that was important for me because I had a very difficult mother who did not show me a way of being an authentic woman. I had no idea what it was to be if I can use the term, a good woman, a functioning, whole, healthy woman by the time I got to adulthood. And when I began then in my 30s, after my third midlife crisis, to wonder about what it might look like to be a good woman. I found examples in the old stories because I just had not seen them in my life. That's unfortunate. Many people have. I have not. And so I think these old stories show us various different ways of being rooted in the land, of being part of the natural world. Those old shape-shifting stories, where women take on the form of crows just as easily as they do humans. That sense of no barrier between us and the natural world is one part of it. But yes, the creative impulse that is very much part of the kind of psychological feminine is another part of it. How can we create beauty and joy around us, even in a profoundly challenged world?
Sharon, I have so many questions for you. Let's talk about Haggitude quickly. I love the title, which is a mix of hag and attitude. And I'm celebrating my 50th birthday this summer. And I'm very excited about starting the book and reading the book, because I am really, really embracing my 50. Especially because my grandmother died when she was 32.
Wow.
And my mom kept telling me she always kept telling me that aging is luxury, which I'm very, very grateful for. I'm sad I've never met her, but I'm grateful to have this lesson and wisdom that you do not take it for granted.
Indeed, most of our ancestors would hardly have lived to go through menopause, so we have the luxury of an extra 2, 3, sometimes more decades of life. And I think the big question for us is, what do we do with them, rather than assuming, as the culture would like us to, rather than assuming that we just go on as we already have, as if nothing has changed, as if nothing has happened. And I really was very taken by Carl Jung's idea that the first half of life might be kind of outward looking, when you're trying to build a family, a career, a persona out in the world. But the second half of life is for inward looking. And he described it as a spiritual journey, but it doesn't have to be. It is just a search for meaning, I think. And I think it takes us to different places. And I think it's really important that we see menopause as kind of a passage into a new story, not the end of the old one.
Before we start talking about your mother, I wanted to ask you about the myths and stories and folklore. And what does it teach us? Does it teach us anything about the mother-daughter relationship?
There are so many myths and fairy tales with mother-daughter relationships, for better or worse, and so many different kinds of mothers in fairy tales, from the evil stepmother to the dead mother. We've got the good mother, we've got the bad mother, we've got the death mother, so you can take your pick of the face of the mother that you want in myths and fairy tales. And I think this is really kind of interesting. And for me, although there are lots of stories which focus on these different types of mother, I have become very much more interested recently in what fairy tales tell us about being a daughter, and particularly about breaking away, that necessary breaking away, not leaving, not loving, but that breaking away from the mother's influence.
But that's beautiful that the fairy tales are covering all these different versions of motherhood and mother-daughter relationships, because this is what life is. This is how it is in real life. Now I've interviewed 140 women about their mothers and their mothers' lessons, and there's no good and bad, wrong and right, or this way or that way. It's all a big kaleidoscope of very different shapes and forms.
Indeed, and the good thing about fairy tales is, because they're timeless and because they're very simple, the archetypal qualities of these women, of these mothers, are very, very vivid. They're not nuanced tales often, and so they allow us to kind of relate them to our own lives much more easily, precisely because they are so essential, so archetypal.
Let's talk about your mother. We've already heard, I know from your books, but you've already mentioned you had a difficult relationship with your mother. Will you tell us a little bit about her?
Indeed, I loved my mother very dearly, but she had a very difficult life herself. She was abused as a teenager. I didn't find that out actually until I was at least 40 myself. And she married my father, who was violent. She found it very hard to cope, and so she turned to alcohol. And that meant, unfortunately, that during my teenage years, she was an alcoholic. Now, she was a binge drinker. So, she would go for like 3 days and she'd be just not there. And the rest of the time she would be functioning. But it added an air of kind of uncertainty because you never knew when it was going to happen. So, as a consequence of that, and as a consequence just of her very difficult and quite controlling personality, although I love my mother very dearly, I seem to have spent most of my life trying to kind of distance myself from her, both emotionally and physically. So, although she stopped drinking, I think, when I would have been 17, which is a very, very good thing, and never ever went back to it. Nevertheless, she had a certain way of being in the world that was very different from mine, and she found it very challenging when people were different from her. So it was kind of always like walking on eggshells, I would say.
What was her name?
Her name was Doris. But we Dory in her later life, and she was born in the northeast of London, northeast of England, I'm sorry, in 1939, just when the war began. So she was a war baby. And what is interesting about my mother, and I've seen it with so many people who grew up during the war, is that there was a tenacity that was admirable. There was a sense that failure is not an option, in the sense, not that you have to succeed, but it's just like life is difficult. Sometimes there isn't food. Sometimes things are threatening and you don't know whether you will survive or not. So that whole sense of getting on with it anyway, to use a bit of a cliche, is very much present in people of that age, and certainly was very much present in my mother. And I think that really was one of the lessons that she taught me, that tenacity, that just never giving up. And she had a very, very difficult time with her health throughout all of her life. And it seemed by the end that she was kind of collecting diagnoses. And although she kind of liked to talk about them, and I felt sometimes she defined herself by them, she never was miserable or angry about them. She didn't complain much. She just had that whole wartime spirit thing. This is my lot, let's just get on with it. And that was kind of admirable at the same time as she was very, very difficult in other ways.
You said that her way of being in the world was very different from yours, and she was not able to accept it. What is the difference? How was it different from yours?
My mother was completely emotion driven and was something of a fantasist. So liked to make things up about her life, about how everything was wonderful when it wasn't, and a little bit hypocritical for, associated with that. And so as a child, I wasn't very effusive. I was quite introverted and quite quiet, and I didn't want to be hugged all the time. I didn't want to be told that I should talk more, that I should come out of myself, that I should sing and dance in public and all of that kind of thing. I just wanted to be quiet, and I felt it was safer to be quiet. And she was constantly kind of rubbing against that. And that led for a complicated childhood, as you can imagine, because you always feel then that you're not enough. That what your mother wants is someone more, someone like her. She was a great comedian, she was very vivacious, and I was very quiet, and that was fine to me. But she seemed to find it somehow like a failure, or perhaps threatening in some way. I don't know. So that made childhood very difficult. She also was very, very angry from time to time. On the one hand, she was, she had this tenacity. On the other hand, she was very, very angry and very moody and very controlling. And you were always walking on eggshells in the house, to make sure that you didn't do something that would spark her off. And of course, I'd tell you how awful you were.
Make you feel inadequate. You know what is extremely interesting? As I just mentioned, I recorded 140 interviews, and very often, especially with guests whose moms were born right after the war, I hear the opposite. I hear that mom was not emotional. She didn't know how to show any emotions. She didn't know how to hug me. She didn't know how to tell me she's proud of me. It's fascinating. I think you're my only guest until now who had the opposite situation.
I did, and I did not want it. I kind of wanted to be left alone. These public displays of affection, it was just too much.
Were they only public? Did she?
No, they weren't. Sorry, I say public. I mean, no, they were both public and private. I didn't really want them private. I just wanted to be kind of I wanted to keep my distance. I didn't mind the odd hug, but I just wanted to be alone, kind of in myself. And really, the situation at home drove me to that, because if you grow up with a violent father and an alcoholic mother, then safety is just kind of closing yourself in a little bit. I'm not suggesting that that was necessarily always a functional thing, but it was who I was, and I always felt that the core of who I was constantly being challenged, and that she would like to have chipped away at it.
And how difficult it is then to get out of your shell and realize that in certain situations you are safe and it's okay to be hugged and loved. I'm not talking, and now I'm talking about myself.
Yes, of course. I think, it's commoner than we think sometimes, that kind of attitude. But I think then in a situation like that, I remember looking at it quite objectively sometimes, as well as emotionally when I was younger, and saying, okay, how can I get away from this kind of stifling mother? And it really was, at first, it was physical distance, so I went to university as far away as I could in England. Eventually I moved to Ireland. She loved Ireland and wanted to come on holiday, so I moved to America. And it was really only when I finally managed to get out of corporate life and I came back to Britain that I had managed to come to terms with it and had managed to see it as not part of me, if you know what I mean. Not some failure in me, not some difference in me, but just that was my mother. And I didn't have to be what she wanted me to be, and I could just be what I wanted. And that ease, when all of a sudden the lightness in me, it's a lot easier to deal with her. So I always had to be with her in very, very short stints. I couldn't ever spend 2 days with her, but I could spend 3 hours with her and then maybe go back for some more. So it was a really interesting process. But I'll tell you what did that for me, just as a bit of an aside, except that it is told fictionally in my novel, The Long Delirious Burning Blue, which is being released again in April. I learned to fly, to overcome a fear of flying. And I think actually to overcome a fear of life. And I felt that what was, holding me back was this kind of obsession with safety, because everything had been so unsafe as a child. And I figured out that if I could look death in the face, I wouldn't be afraid of living anymore. So I learned to fly. It taught me all kinds of things about letting go of my own stuff, my old burdens, and just like the focus of just keeping yourself in the air and not falling out of it meant that I had a lightness as a consequence of that I hadn't had, and I didn't take much seriously anymore. And so when I went back to the UK and lived very close to my mother for the first time ever, since I'd been a child, then there were ways to manage it. And she responded to that, to the fact that I wasn't being needled or irritated. And it just kind of settled into something quite pleasant in the end.
You're talking about flying, and I'm wondering if it's also finding that you are in control. And I'm wondering if that helped the relationship with your mom.
I don't think flying for me was about control. I actually think it was the opposite, interestingly, perhaps, because I had always been desperately in control. I mean, when you grow up in a situation that's chaotic, what do? I was the mother. I took responsibility. I was in control when she was just not there because she was drinking. And so it was really about letting go of control. It's just like, okay, I know how this plane works. I know how to fly it, but it's not within my control necessarily, what the weather is, whether the plane breaks or whatever, whether I tumble to the ground in a flash of fire. None of that was in my control. And that was what shifted everything for me. And I think it was just that the lightness that comes with that acceptance that that's okay. You can not be in control and you're still flying, you're still achieving this thing, which for me was something of a miracle, just lightened all of my relationships, including the one with my mother.
I am now very curious to hear what you feel are the most important lessons you've learned from her.
Sometimes they seem a little bit negative, the lessons, almost as if they're kind of antidotes to being. But that tenacity that I was talking about earlier, I would say is absolutely the key one. That sense of just getting on with it, even though sometimes everything is terrible around you. And I think in the world today, when there are challenges clearly everywhere, political, social, whatever, I think that sense of no, just get on with the job in a good way. You have something to do, just do it. I learned that from my mother, that kind of strength That is a strength. She was very strong at the same time as she was an alcoholic, which seems weak, but she had a great strength, a great tenacity. And I think that was a very, very fine thing to learn.
Anything else?
The second is really always tell the truth about who you are and where you're from. That's a kind of antidote to my mother, but she was a bit of a fantasist. She was a dreamer. She had this image of who she was, a role that she played. She played a role all the time, particularly in public, but sometimes in private. And I learned from that actually how important it was to try to be authentically you, warts and all, because it didn't go down well. And my mother never had any friends, really close friends, because it was always very clear that she was playing this role. She was very bad at it. And so that was a really interesting and important lesson as well, to just to be truthful about that, at least. And the other thing that I learned from my mother, and again, this is kind of an antidote, is that it's not all about you. My mother, when I first was writing If Women Rose Rooted, which was very much a kind of fictionalization of this mother-daughter relationship that I had with her, she was very angry at first that I was telling her story because it was her story. And it took me a long time to help her to understand that actually I was in that story too, and that I had a part in it and that it affected me. And this sense of my mother's obsession with herself from being very, very small. I remember this, her obsession with herself and her only one way of seeing a story, and all of the unfairnesses that are associated with that, that your story doesn't get told, you're kind of molded into some character in a story that's in her head rather than the character that you are. That also was a very, very big part of my learning, that everybody has a story. Whatever story you think you're in, look at that story from somebody else's perspective and look at how they see you. And she didn't intend to teach me that. I don't think she intended to teach me many of the things that she taught me, actually, but it was a very, very important learning that really plays into my work and my writing today. But what she couldn't teach me is
I just wanted to ask you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, there you go.
I love it. I love it. Yes.
What she couldn't teach me was how to be an authentic woman, because she was not an authentic woman. She always wanted to play the very traditional role. She wanted someone to look after her. She didn't, actually. She looked after us all through her life and worked, but she never wanted that. She never wanted to be her own woman. She wanted someone to look after her. She hated women judges. She hated women priests. She was very traditional in her perspective. And so she was always railing against who she was and the fact that she had to work even though she did it. And that sense of, as I said earlier, of not knowing how to be a woman when it came to it, was particularly strong in my 40s when I was going through that whole midlife transition thing and leaving corporate life. And it's okay, what then? That's one thing that she never taught me.
I think we miss a word a little here. A real woman, authentic woman, a strong woman, a woman in her own power, with all our different dimensions and facets and sides.
Yes, that is authenticity to me. I mean, that's being who you are, displaying your gift to the world, not trying to be somebody that you're not.
Yeah. Oh, these are big lessons, Sharon.
I think they probably always are with our mothers, really.
They always are. Or sometimes people haven't recognized or weren't able to recognize what they've learned, so they feel like there were no big lessons there. Is there anything else you'd like to share about lessons before we recap?
Just to say that I think, I didn't figure out what had happened to me in the context of my mother till I was about 40 years old, and I was supposed to be a psychologist. I had no clue that so many of the ways that I behaved, so many of the difficulties I had in the world were as a consequence of my relationship with my mother, and particularly her drinking. There's a whole set of characteristics that daughters of alcoholic mothers display, and I had no clue until I was 40. And so I think, often these things don't reveal themselves to us all at once. I think we learn, and new things come up for me. My mother is dead now. New things come up for me every time I think of her. It's just, the ways in which it's affected me. So just to say really to anybody listening, just accept that it's a lifelong process. There's no point where you've got it. The wisdom, the learnings just keep on coming, I think, throughout your life, because it's such an important relationship.
Thank you so much for saying that. I want to stress, and this I've learned since I lost my mom in 2016, as you mentioned, this relationship keeps evolving. We're not done just because they're not here anymore. And for me, this is a beautiful thing. My relationship with my mom also keeps evolving and changing the whole time, as you just mentioned. This is important. It's not something you can be done with and put in a drawer.
No, I don't think you ever do that.
Yeah, yeah. Let me just quickly recap what we've learned from your mom, Doris. So we learned about tenacity, not giving up, and not complaining. When you have to do something, just go through it without complaining. We learned that it's important to be your authentic self and always tell the truth about who you are and where you come from. And that it's not all about you, that there are other people with their own stories. Sometimes you're part of somebody else's story. You don't have to be a center, or a main character in every story. And something you wish she had taught you is how to be the woman, the authentic woman. You said good woman at one point. I want to say a strong woman, empowered woman. Yes, I think these are the lessons we covered.
Thank you. Perfectly summarized.
Thank you so much again for being my guest. As always, I will put a link to your website in my episode notes so my listeners can learn more about you and your work. I really, really want to invite them to read your books and look into your work. It has inspired me tremendously, and I want to thank you again for that.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much. It was a lovely conversation. And yeah, do send me the link and I'll make sure to share it.
Thank you. If you enjoy Thank You Mama and want to help it grow, please take the 2 seconds to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me a mail at info@thankyoumama.net. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under Anna Teider, that's Tajder. This was Thank You Mama. Come back next week, subscribe, and tell your friends.